just flew in on a red-eye, so I want to make, from LA, so I don't know my name or what time it is, but I'm very excited to be here. My name is Deana. I work with United States Artists, and I think I want to start by just saying that one of the reasons I'm so compelled by this initiative is not just that what I do for a living relies incredibly heavily on arts philanthropists. What USA does, for those who don't know, is we raise money and redistribute it out to artists in the form of unrestricted grants. So literally, we raise money from a donor and give it to an artist. We're a straight pass-through. And so when I was contacted by the Knight Foundation and M+ to think about this Art Funders Forum, I was really animated by that, because everything that was said earlier directly affects our work. We are also watching these various declines in public funding. But I think more importantly, the reason I'm so compelled by this is, and one of the reasons I do this work at all, is I truly believe that art has the most potential to create free human beings. And that our country right now and the world at large is in a moment where we're all thinking about liberation, what it means to be around people who are different than us, how to think beyond ourselves. And I believe deeply that art can help us do that more than any other industry. And I feel like the way to leverage the power of that is to grow the audience of the arts. And for me, cultural philanthropists, be it foundations or individuals, are just one more audience that at least I personally and USA, the organization I serve, think about in that context. And so to dive right in, the statistic that Sean pulled up earlier, that 78% of the people they interviewed were very concerned about the future of arts funding. When I first saw it, it surprised me, because I'm an optimist, and I don't want to believe that's true, even though all the data points to it. But frankly, I think maybe one of the reasons I'm up here is that I was probably one of the people on the most concerned side. And I have been very, very, very worried about the state and the future of arts funding, both from my background in museums, but then really specifically at USA, where we fundraise nationally and across every discipline, from architecture and design to craft to visual art, music, dance, film. And so we're watching cultural philanthropy from every angle. And it's terrifying to watch it get harder and harder and harder. And at United States Artists, some of the things we've been asking ourselves is why, right? Like, why are all of us in this room? How did we fall under the spell of this field, and why is it so hard to justify it to all these other smart, intelligent, incredible people? And we always hit the same things, right? It's hard to fundraise for the arts at a time when it feels like social services are so important, the environment, public health, public safety, et cetera. And there is not as much urgency to do that in the cultural sector right now. And we always come back to, well, what we do in the cultural sector is we make language. We help complicated things get distilled, right? And I think increasingly in our country, we are less able to deal with complex things, right? We don't have an appetite for it. And so we always think art's one of the easiest ways to talk about the environment, public health, public safety, et cetera, and to make those things clearer to a public. So why is it that we can't connect these things? Why is it that folks just sleep on the arts? And we've had that problem, I think, forever in our industry, throughout all decades. It didn't start with the cultural wars in the 90s, it was long before then. But now comes in this audience, this younger generation that everyone's kind of obsessing over and curious about, this next-gen donor, and what affects them, and why are they more interested in impact investing, or they are deeply, deeply motivated by helping the country and helping the world, and so why can't we drive them towards the arts? And some of the questions we've been asking at work, if they're helpful here, is I just don't think we're telling them about us as clearly as we can. And at USA, lately, we've been deeply animated by media work and wondering if we're not leveraging those tools strong enough. And if what if the arts does is make language, why aren't we communicating that language more broadly? And I'm not just talking about, blogs and small things here that I think are happening across cultural institutions across the country. I'm talking about we're living in a moment where we know how people communicate. They communicate through podcast and Netflix and the radio. They're using huge media production tools to communicate messages about everything across. I think from our vantage point, we saw it most clearly with the culinary sector and how they went from being an obscure, small, fine dining versus street food to really becoming a phenomenon across the entire country, socioeconomically and race, because of things like TV and radio. And we've been wondering, why is our sector not accessing some of those tools more? Why aren't we talking and telling the stories we have through these channels that reach such a wide demographic? And we do hear it from next-gen donors that at least USA is talking to. They just say, we don't fund you because we don't actually know what you're doing, and you should tell us more. And I think at USA, we talk a lot about what is a delicious podcast for the arts. What is a good Netflix series? I want to see Hank Willis Thomas on The Daily Show all the time, you know, representing us in our sector because he deals with issues of policy and politics and things that deeply matter. I'm sorry, Hank, he's back there, and I didn't really tell him I would do this, but I really do want to see him on The Daily Show. We've been tracking, how did sports do this? How did religion do it? How did they break out of some of their small niche audiences? And it was because they used media tools. They picked people to represent them, de facto leaders that go on and talk about the issues of our times. Every once in a while, when our staff is really stressed and we don't know how to solve this problem, we play this game where we pick different artists that would make our version of The View. Like instead of Whoopi Goldberg and who are like the 4 artists, we'd have host The View. And every time there's like a social issue or political issue, who would we have talk about that? Because what we know about next-gen donors and what we know about the folks that don't think our sector is for them is that when we bring them in and they hear it and they see it, when it is accessible with them, they almost always change their mind. And my concern is I don't know how to do that one person at a time, cultural institution at a time, and not think really broadly. And I think this is the role funders play, right? Because from my vantage point, funders speak across the nation, across sectors, in so many different ways. And there are an infinite number of ways that funders could help elevate our game nationally, right? Really forefront, who are the artists that represent us the best? And I think right now it's so urgent that we need to stack our bench, right? Like we need to know what artists speak languages that make sense for a public to access them, which is why I'm gonna keep saying I wanna see Hank Willis Thomas on The Daily Show until he's on it, because I would consider Hank and many other artists those artists. I grew up in an immigrant family that did not think culture was for them. I did not grow up going to museums. My mother literally thinks I'm an interior decorator. She has no idea what I do, no matter how much I try to explain it. And I started playing this game where I was kind of sick of this, right? Like I was sick of being the kid in my family who's like not a doctor, engineer, or lawyer. So I started bringing my parents to things that resonated with them. And I stopped pretending that they were gonna care about certain shows at MoMA. And instead I started taking them to things that I thought would align with their values. And slowly but surely, now it makes sense what I do. And now my mom tells her sisters and her brothers about certain artists she's hearing about because they connected with her. But it took a long time to get there. And so I don't have any answers, and I really have no idea what my keynote is supposed to be about. And I am coming off of a red eye. But I think what I'm saying is that there is a language we speak, and I don't think we're doing a good enough job leveraging it. And I want to be part of a movement that's doing that. And if there are funders in the room that are operating nationally, who are your stars? And how do we stack our bench and get them a much, much larger platform than what we're doing right now? Because I feel like if we can get audiences and we can leverage media platforms and tools, the funding will follow. Or in the very least, the public will follow. The public imagination around the arts will grow. And I am one of the ones that's on the dire side of thinking about cultural philanthropy. And so I don't know how to think smaller than that. And I guess I'm urging funders to work with us to think bigger than ourselves, because some of us are so strapped at nonprofits, we're so worried about the day-to-day that we can't get outside of ourselves. And a few small things, if they're helpful, one thing we ask all the time is what's actually considered, from a funding perspective, at least working with cultural nonprofits, how are we looking at budgets, right? Because I hate that communications is an operating and it's not a programming expense. And I think that every single funder, if you work with cultural nonprofits you believe with, you should look at their communications line item budget. And you should encourage them to think bigger and to view it as a program. Yeah, hell yeah. But I think, I think that we're way past the time where the storytelling has to be as important as the work itself. Thank you. With that, I would like to thank everybody at AFF. Somebody clapped for me, so I'm just going to pretend that means I'm done. And I want to welcome someone who is very special to me, because I actually think she does a phenomenal job doing this, both as a funder and a consumer of arts and culture, Sarah Arison, who is the head of the Arison Arts Foundation, chair of the Young Arts Board, and someone who I think has done a phenomenal job trying to tell stories of why art matters to lots of different people, not just the church that we've already indoctrinated. Sarah? Thank you. And I will be talking to her right over here. Hi, buddy.
Hi.
So just full disclosure, so we work with Sarah at USA.
Yes.
I have worked with Young Arts a little bit, and I love them.
A
lot of it.
Okay. Deana has a show up right now on our campus, and it's amazing. She got to curate all of our visual arts alums, and it's at 2100 Biscayne Boulevard, and she's an amazing curator on top of everything else. So
yeah, it's funny. All the contributors are Young Arts alumni, so they were mostly in their 20s. I've never worked with more organized artists in my life. And they're all like literally, and I'm like, oh, that's what Young Arts does. They were like, yeah, we're all out of the School of Young Arts. Like, we know how to get you everything on time. But anyway, I'm very honored to be talking to Sarah today. And I think one thing that strikes me as very unique about your practice is not only your commitment to cultural philanthropy, but the breadth of it. From my vantage point, Sarah supports artists, individual artists, by way of things like Young Arts and United States artists. You support museums, dance, film. It's like there's no shortage of it. So I'm curious, A, where does that come from? How did that start? And then B, why so well-rounded? Why not just stick to one specific sector or one discipline or one thing? Why try to do it all?
I think to start with, where it began is looking back, every interaction with my grandparents from when I was very young revolved around the arts. So actually one of my first memories is walking into Lincoln Theater right here with them to see the New World Symphony.
Aww.
I mean, and you know, we went to the ballet and we went to museums, and it's something that at the time I definitely did not realize how impactful it was or how unique it was and how special it was. But looking back, I realize, you know, that is so much of the reason why I am who I am today and why I do what I do. And also how important it is that everybody has that access. And you know, you were talking about access and about making audiences feel like programming in the arts belongs to them, and I think that is really important. I think that everybody should feel like they can bring their kids or their grandkids into a symphony hall or a museum or a gallery or whatever it might be, which is, I think, not the case.
Yeah.
I think we're still dealing with that ivory tower mentality.
Absolutely.
Which is terrible because, you know, kids are growing up feeling like it's not for them, feeling like they're on the outside, and there's nothing for them inside there, that they won't understand it, they don't have the money, they don't have the education, you know, whatever it might be. And that's something that I think is really important that we all work on, is that accessibility. And so really exposure early on to all forms of art. And then, you know, as far as working with, you know, artists of so many different disciplines and, you know, organizations that serve so many disciplines, you know, and I see this so much with Young Arts, because one of the things that makes us very unique is that we really do work with artists of all disciplines. You know, we have 10 disciplines, and even within those disciplines, you know, within the dance disciplines, it's, you have your classical ballet dancers, and you have your Irish step dancers, and your traditional West African dancers. And all of them receive, you know, equal attention and care. And what I see is, you know, bringing them all together, I hear over and over, you know, they say, I came here thinking of myself as a cellist, and now I think of myself as an artist, because I'm around artists from many other disciplines, and I'm encouraged to collaborate with them, which I think is very rare. You look at universities now, and for the most part, I think there are a couple of exceptions, but they're very siloed. You have your writers here, and you have your architects here, and your dancers here, and they never meet, and they never get to see each other's work, and they never get to collaborate. And I think the most magical things happen when those silos are taken away. I also think that, you know, artists really, they don't see themselves as being just one discipline. You see the most amazing things happen when you have a painter who decides to experiment in film. And giving them those opportunities is really transformative. And I think that by working with many different institutions across disciplines, you can bring those institutions together. You know, I'm on the board of American Ballet Theater, and it was I think it was a Young Arts dinner a number of years ago, where we had two of our master teachers. We had Jessica Lang, who's an unbelievable choreographer who choreographs for ABT, and Jose Parla, who's an incredible visual artist. And they met and they started chatting, and 2 years later, they premiered a piece together.
Totally. And
it was great. Jose did the sets and he did a video, and Jessica did the choreography, and it was extraordinary. And it's just, you know, bringing disciplines together, bringing different institutions together and different disciplines together, and giving the artist that freedom to experiment and create.
I also feel like that tracks, in my mind, the way I think there really is a role for large national philanthropy to play in this, right? Which is, for most foundations or big funders, they are funding different things, and those things are not always in conversation. Right. And so if we're trying to fight the fight of people just supporting culture writ large, it's like, how are you putting your visual arts organizations, design organizations, dance organizations in any construct together? Because no one discipline can fight this fight alone. Like, it's not going to work.
Right, and you have to really facilitate those conversations. And I
Exactly.
think in addition to programmatic collaborations, you know, they're like, I look in at Young Arts, we are really identifying artists at a much earlier time than I think a lot of organizations are working with them. We start with them when they're in high school. And we do that really well, and we've been doing it really well for almost 40 years. But, you know, what's next? That's one critical juncture. What about that kind of post-secondary education, BFA, MFA, whatever it might be, where they go out into the real world and they need some real support?
Absolutely.
You know, I want to be there for them in that way, but I don't think we have the experience or expertise or anything to do that. So who's out there that we can collaborate with?
Absolutely.
Can we pass them on to United States artists?
Yeah.
Can we pass them on to, you know, different residencies and internships and fellowships? And, you know, let's create this network of support kind of starting when, you know, they're very young, and continuing with them along their career until they might hit a point where they are able to get back to that next generation.
And then I'm curious, Sarah, as someone who I think represents a lot of the institutions you serve, do you find it hard convincing your friends or other folks to support those things? Like, how do you help literally just raise money for things like this today?
You know, I think it's more and more kind of figuring out, and I think, you know, experienced funders recognize, and this was something that was mentioned earlier, that, you know, organizations need money to just keep the lights on.
Totally.
You know, they need that operational funding.
Yep.
And so I think there are funders that get that, and that's very important. And, you know, for others, you know, it's kind of creating programming that really resonates with them.
Yeah.
So, you know, with us, we have all these disciplines. It's, you know, and so it might be somebody who's really passionate about film, and they can, you know, sponsor the film discipline. You know, coming up with programmatic options that people can really connect to and relate to, to kind of tailor the support to whatever might be their passion.
And do you find that do you think some of the young people coming out of Young Arts will later become supporters of art?
Yes.
Like, do you think that you can actually, because we track that pretty heavily, and you have hundreds of alumni at this point.
20,000.
Oh, 20, my God, okay, thousands of alumni at this point. So do you think really exposure to the arts early also mechanizes why it matters for someone later?
Yeah, and you know, that's the thing, is I'm asked often, like, you know, what percentage of the artists that go through Young Art are practicing artists? And that is actually not as important to us, because you're putting people out in the world who understand what it means to be an artist, what artists need. Are there going to be the patrons and the audiences and everything that you have to have in order to have, in order for artists to survive?
I recently learned the woman who wrote the Implicit Bias book at Harvard, she was saying in all of their research, she's now been doing this work for 20 years, you do not change society doesn't change when you change people's hearts and minds. Society changes when people change their behavior. And she literally just said, if every single kid had access to art in this country, if they just had to do it, not every kid's gonna turn out to be an artist, but we will just have a society that cares more about art because it's in their behavior now, and I think Young Arts is such an excellent demonstration of that.
Well, it's also, you know, I think people often look at, you know, supporting the arts or artists as walking into a booth at Art Basel and buying a piece off the wall, or walking to, you know, to Broadway and buying a ticket. What I always say is, you look at every single aspect of your life, and I'm talking about the house that you live in, that was an architect, that's an artist. The television show that you're watching on Netflix, that is a writer, a cinematographer, a composer. You know, and there's literally kind of nothing that you can look at that wasn't touched by an artist. And so rather than thinking of it as in these, like, you know, this is where art lives and this is where art lives, like, it is actually all around you. It's literally everywhere, and it's created by artists.
Do you know that scene in The Devil Wears Prada? Does anybody remember where she's like, fashion's not for me? And she's like, no, it's for everyone.
Everybody.
That color you're wearing came from this. It's
exactly.
real. And actually, that argument for USA works a lot. And I think Young Arts probably has the same advantage, which is when you fund in every discipline, you have more than one entry point. So folks who might feel isolated from visual art, museums, fairs, they find something in literature, dance. And so I think leveraging those points, that it's around you all the time, I don't know if you'd agree that we just have to package that better. That it is around you all the time. You're already doing it. And the world without it would be a very dismal place. Yes. Is there anything you'd like to add before our little buzzers?
Oh, we got a buzzer. No, just you do amazing work and keep it
Likewise,
up. And
thank
it's awesome
you.
to work with you.
Can I share one little anecdote that I think I'll get in trouble for sharing before we scooch off?
God.
So Sarah is one of our donors at USA, and I just want to share that when you fund for art, it's hard, as we're all talking about. Fundraising for artists, harder. Unrestricted fundraising for artists is like impossible, like finding donors that feel comfortable making a grant. And our artists use it in all kinds of ways. They pay off debt. We've made 4 babies at this point that we're very proud of via in vitro. They buy property, they make new work, but we don't track it. You get to do what you want to do with it. And one thing we really struggle with is, when Sarah mentioned earlier, and I did a little bit too, the operating issue. What percentage are we using to operate versus give to artists? And this struggles, all nonprofits struggle with this. I think the market rate right now is 20%. Nonprofits should keep all their operating under 20%. And over the past year and a half, we decided to not do that at USA. And we actually amped our operating costs up to 45%, which is pretty wild. But there's more to it. This is the first year since 2012 that we'll be making 50 fellowships. We're offering every single artist access to a financial planner and to artist resources we could never afford to do a few years ago. But that was because we invested in our staff, we invested in our communications, and we invested in fundraising. And all of the money went up, even if the operating costs went up too. And I want to say that because Sarah's one of our donors, and I think is one of the most, I would say, forward-thinking donors I've ever worked with, and seems to be very open to organizations needing to do what they need to do to serve their publics. But with a room of funders, I feel like I'd be remiss to not mention it, that if you talk to your nonprofits about what they need, rather than stick them to very narrow buckets and metrics and percentages, you'd maybe be surprised by what they can actually output on the back end. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you.